Hello, good friends, how you doing? Okay, I'm gonna try to record another video for you guys, and today I want to talk to you about something that has been really helpful for me in my English studies, which is podcasts, English podcasts. Since I started to learn English like 5 years ago, I decided, okay, from now on I'm gonna learn English. And what I did the most was listening to English podcasts, And then I've decided to record you a video about the podcasts that has been helpful for me so far. And the first one I started to listen 5 years ago was the Lindsay and Michelle Kaplan podcast, All Ears English. This podcast was the first one I started to listen to every day. And they do daily podcasts, about English. And they answer questions from their students and their listeners, and people ask them questions about expressions, about words, about everything, and they answer that questions with examples, and it's really helpful for English learners. I really recommend their podcast. And they also have this method of transcript, which you can buy their transcript and you can read what they are talking. This is really helpful for the beginners, Sometimes you can't separate the words because the natural way of speaking just mix the words and you can't understand, but reading what they are saying you can understand what they are saying, and you start to train your ears to understand native English speakers talking, right? And the number 2 podcast that I discovered and I still listen till nowadays, it was the AJ Hope podcast, the Effortless English podcast. AJ Hope is a very good teacher, and his method for me is one of the best because he teaches through stories, through mini stories. He say these mini stories and you listen to the stories, and he keeps asking questions in the middle of these little stories, and you have to answer that question, so you have to pay attention to what he is talking about, It's really cool because the stories are absurd stories, like the spider that swim, or the astronaut cow, stories really absurd, but because this is really weird stories, you can't forget, This is I think that this is why his method is so powerful. And he say the same story in the present, in the past, in the future, and he keep asking questions for you about the story, and it's really helpful. It is, if not the best, one of the best methods of learning English in the world, in my opinion. Okay? So, another podcast that I like to listen to is the Coach Shane podcast. Coach Shane, his podcast is really quick. It's not a long podcast, but he talks about English expressions that native speakers talk, and we can't understand if someone who knows what the person is talking about. You wouldn't understand if some native English speaker explained this to you. Like, for example, the expression, the early bird gets the worm. I know that a lot of you guys know what it means, but if you don't know what it means, how you would understand this expression? This expression means that people that get up early in the morning get better results in life than the lazy ones. In Portuguese, we have the same expression. It's something like God helps the ones who get up early. It's the same expression, the same meaning, but in English you have to say the early bird gets the worm. So when you listen to this expression, you immediately know what the other person is talking about, okay? And without a native English speaker telling you what it means, you probably wouldn't understand, right? So this is why I really recommend his podcast. And he's really funny, really good guy, and I really recommend his podcast. Another podcast that I like so much is the Tony Kaizen podcast, Life in English. Tony Kaizen is a young boy. For me, he is a young boy. I'm 43, he's more or less than 30, I think. But he's a really wise guy. His podcast is more about encouragement, He encouraged people to stop being afraid to talk, stop being shy, and try and don't care about what other people will think about your way of talking, your accent, this kind of thing, Don't care about what other people will think of your English. And then you get free to make your mistakes and try to speak your way. The important here is to the other person understand what you are trying to say. And he is also his content is he's a really wise man. He sounds like some more experienced guy because his messages are good, not just for learning English, but for life. I really like this podcast. I really like his recommendations, and I really recommend for you his podcast, Tony Kaizen, Life in English. Okay? Another podcast that I listen and I like to listen is Hadar Podcast, the Influency Podcast. Hadar Shemesh, she is from Israel. She is a woman, a non-native English speaker who teaches about English accent, and it's really helpful for people that are trying to improve their accent, because sometimes the muscles of our mouth is not prepared to speak English, I remember when I was beginning trying to speak, I was not prepared at all, and the muscles of my mouth was not prepared to make sounds that are not normal, that simply doesn't exist in my native language. like the TH sound, the thing, for example, for me, I always struggle when I have to say something with the TH sound because it's not natural for me. This is just a blowing with the tongue between your teeth. This is not natural at all for me, and I always struggle trying to reproduce this sound, but this is what it is. We have to learn, and we have to don't be shy to reproduce these sounds that are not natural for us. Another podcast that I recommend about English is the Look podcast. This podcast is more for people that want to learn the British English because he's British, and I like his podcast so much. It was my friend Denise from our group that recommended me, and this Look podcast is really good because I really like the British sarcasm. They are really funny, they are smart, they are sarcastic, and I just love the English sarcasm, and they are really good in this kind of humor. I know this is not a humor podcast, it's an English podcast, but he's English, so he is naturally sarcastic. So that's why I love it. And when I decided that I was prepared to try to listen other podcasts that are not about English, but they are in English, I said to myself, okay, now I'm prepared to try to listen podcasts about things that are things that I like to listen, that is from my interest, And then I start to follow these other podcasts. The first one is The Order of Man by Ryan Michler. Order of Man is a podcast that helps men to be manly, which is something that nowadays is getting kind of polemic. Men are not being trained to be men anymore, and he helps these little boys that has no a manly figure to follow and to become a better man. And I really like his podcast. I think that every man should listen to his podcast, and it's helpful not just for men, but for people around the man you are. If you want to be a good husband, a good father, a good employee, a good boss, this is helpful for you to be this man that you are meant to be, like he said. Okay? And then there is another podcast that I like to listen so much, which is Andy Frisella podcast. The Andy Frisella, it was called the MF CEO. Now it's called Real AF, I think. I listened to this podcast a long time. And Andy Frisella is an entrepreneur, and he gives tips for people that are trying to improve their careers, to improve their business, and he is a really cool guy, and he's not afraid to say what he thinks. Nowadays people are too afraid to say what they think. He's not this kind of guy. He's the kind of man that everyone should be. You shouldn't be afraid to defend what you believe. And he's this kind of man. I like to listen the Andy Frisella podcast because of this. He's, like the Americans say, he's legit, and I like it. Another podcast that I listen to almost every day is Jocko Willink podcast, Jocko and Echo. Jocko is a former Navy SEAL, and he say things about war, he say things about life, about leadership. He teaches a lot about leadership, and he's really good. I like to listen to his podcast. His voice for podcast is unique. You have to listen to understand. But him with Echo, they are really hilarious sometimes too, and it's good for you that are trying to listen to an advanced, to improve to an advanced level, because it's not for English learners, it's for natives. So it's really good for you that are trying to understand native on their daily life style of talking, okay? And we are getting to the end of my favorite podcasts. I have to say about other two podcasts that I like to listen. The first one is The Secret Room by Ben. The Secret Room is a podcast where he invites people to expose their secret stories, stories that people are too shy to say to anyone, and sometimes they go there and they don't say their names, or they don't say who they are, and they share these stories. Sometimes are sad stories, sometimes are funny stories, but always secret stories. And it's really good for your listening. You are always listen to the person telling you a story about their lives, and you have to follow. And it's really good. It helps you improve your English listening a lot. And the other one is The Overwhelmed Brain. The Overwhelmed Brain is more a psychological podcast. It's to help people that kind of struggle with emotional anxiousness, this kind of modern issues that we have nowadays. My grandpa don't had anxiousness, but people nowadays have this. I think that it's because we have too much options in life, and because our lives is too easy, to be honest, so we get anxious. Which movie I'm gonna watch? Oh, I can't decide. I'm anxious. And, I think that it's more this kind of modern issue. But I'm not saying this is not an issue. This is not a problem, guys. This is why I like to listen to the Overwhelmed Brain podcast. Okay? And that's it. I know it's been kind of a long video today because there was a lot of podcasts, and I still listen to all of these podcasts till nowadays. And I want you to share with me which podcasts do you recommend. which podcasts has been helpful for you in your English studies. Okay? So thank you very much for watching, and I see you next time. Ta-da!